Welcome back to the Empowering Parents program. We're going to continue to move forward, and today's topic is going to be walking the middle path. So, at this point, what we've covered is understanding your states of mind, recognizing ways to get unstuck from those states of mind that become ineffective in terms of responding to your young person within when they're dysregulated, and giving you a few extra strategies to helping you get unstuck. What we're going to focus on today are understanding a couple of dilemmas that show up with parents and young adults, teens, and kids with emotion dysregulation. It is it is common, it is normal and developmentally appropriate for there to be disagreements on topics like curfew, grades, substance use, tattoos, appearances, academics, and so on. However, these issues can become really polarizing experiences for a lot of families that encounter emotion dysregulation. So, if you kind of picture what can end up happening is that parents are on one side of a Grand Canyon and their kid is on the other side. And they're playing, they're both kind of tugging on this rope and they're trying to pull each other onto one side or the other. It's very much an either or experience. And parents and their kids become very stuck, and it becomes the option of I either have to join them on their side or I have to tug and pull them to get to my side. And usually that means bigger reactions or bigger punishments, bigger consequences. And so, what we're looking at is trying to figure out how we understand what keeps us on one side, and essentially we want to walk the middle path. We want to find a balance between the two. This does not mean compromise. So I want to make that clear up front. This can look like compromise and negotiations as needed. However, walking the middle path is really using a dialectical lens that we both have validity on either side of the canyon, and we're able to see the truth in both sides. Sometimes it's a kernel, and sometimes it's bigger than that. However, in order to create effective change, we cannot do this from a polarized place. So we have to set down our ropes and we have to join one another. This doesn't mean that you forget your side of it. It just means you do set down the rope with the disagreement and work to see the truth on both sides. So, I want you to kind of keep that in mind as we walk through some common dialectical dilemmas, and these are addressed in comprehensive DBT, especially for adolescents. So, the first one on this worksheet is looking at being too loose or too strict. So, before I jump into all the explanations, I do want to point out that this can be an individual experience. That individually, you can experience being too loose and too strict with your own self. We can see this a lot with diet and exercise. We can find ourselves on the too strict side where we become very rigid and restrictive in terms of the foods that we eat and our exercise routine. We could also be too loose with it, where we're not accounting for any of the nutrition and aren't engaging in any kind of activity that helps support our body. What ends up happening at most often is that for whatever certain time frame we find ourselves in either side of that canyon, we end up vacillating and kind of swinging over into the other side of it. Like if I'm holding this restrictedness, I can only maintain here for so long, to which then I will counter swing exactly the same way over to the too loose side, where I've thrown my hands up and I stop engaging in all of my exercise and nutrition plan. So we're trying to look at how does this show up for me individually, and that will also probably be the case for your young person with emotion dysregulation, that they may be swinging from one side of the canyon to the other. And we want to see it in patterns in the family. How does this show up in terms of parenting? So I want you to just pause for a moment Do you think that you find yourself swinging from one side to the other? Like at times you find yourself kind of being very strict as a parent to then kind of throwing your hands up and saying, I'm not really engaging and planning and they've got it from here, kind of on that too loose side? Or do you tend to feel pretty grounded in one side or the other? Or do you feel like you are pretty balanced in terms of applying strictness as needed and seeing that on a continuum and being loose where you can? I'm just kind of asking you to think kind of loosely where you think you fall. And I think it's important to recognize how what are our patterns across the board as a parent in terms of how we're reacting and how we're parenting and using certain guidelines for our teen. So if we look at the opposites, what we can then do is think about, well, what does the middle path look like for this dilemma that we encounter? What it looks like and what's listed on your handout is that the middle path is having clear rules and enforcing them consistently, and at the same time, be willing to negotiate on some issues and don't overuse consequences. So, what does that look like? We're going to just take an example with education and walk through that to begin with. And that'll give you a little bit of a parameter to how you then start to look at, all right, what are some of the parenting points where I struggle the most with my teen or young adult? Is it in curfews? Is it in attendance with school? Is it grades? Is it finances, right? Whatever it might be. But for now, we're going to just kind of zoom in on education so that we can apply this understanding. So, thinking about education, do you find yourself disagreeing with educational decisions that your young person's making? Thinking about how often they study, what classes they take, what level of status they are, full time, part time? Are they not enrolled? Are they virtual? Are they homebound? How often do they attend class? Do they take time off for any reasons, etc., etc.? And where do you fall on these issues? Do you tend to align with your young person? Do you tend to go over to their side of the canyon where you feel like maybe you're a little too loose and not pushing enough for change? Or do you feel like you're over on the stricter side where you're asking a lot more for change or relying more on consequences? So let's look at what too strict can look like. I'm sure there's a lot more examples and ways to apply the too strict around education, but just to begin with, this could be a demand or um, a requirement to take specific classes. It could look like setting up a study schedule that they must adhere to, maintain full-time status, complete all assignments by a certain time frame, attend all in-classroom sessions or online sessions, no misses and tardies are allowed, and monitoring all communications with their teachers. Do you find yourself saying things like, you must do this, and if not, there are punishments that are going to be implemented? Um, is it hard to also maintain punishments, or do you find that your kid is unable to get out of punishments because they keep kind of accruing those? Essentially, um, are you relying on punishments to help guide academic behaviors? Right? Do you use a lot of consequences to help get the behavior that you want to see? So kind of jot that down, think about where you fall in terms of educational and academic needs. The other side of this is the too loose, and this can look like, sure, there's other examples. It can look like being completely uninvolved with educational decisions about classes, about full-time, part-time status, taking off or staying enrolled. Could be zero monitoring or engagement in communications with teachers or the school, letting your kids make all their decisions about what classes to make. It could even be unsure of where they stand academically, what grades they've been receiving. And again, you're going to take this in terms of like age appropriateness. And if homebound, not checking in on completing or assisting them in terms of like the structure of learning, as that can be hard to implement at home. It comes with its own set of challenges. Essentially, do you find yourself regularly not checking in on school issues and kind of under the belief that it's their choice or they don't need me, and if they do need me, they'll figure it out or they'll ask me, and are there zero consequences surrounding school? So take a moment to jot down where you might fall and kind of just assess, do you find yourself on one side mostly? Do you find yourself kind of swinging back and forth between being strict and involved to being uninvolved and disengaged? So let's look at this middle path option. When you're walking the middle path between too loose and too strict when it comes to education, what this can look like. Okay. Lots of different options involved in terms of walking the middle path educationally. It can look like having clear rules that there's an expectation to have study time ranging from a certain amount of time per week. So, what you could do is 15 to 20 hours of studying per week. This adds flexibility, which is more realistic for folks, for any humans, and especially those with pervasive emotion dysregulation, that they may have a really difficult week where symptoms are pretty significant. And we want to give that wiggle room for things that we just can't anticipate or they just don't have the skills quite yet to regulate. Grades could be monitored mid semester and end of the semester. So instead of kind of a regular or really frequent monitoring, you could kind of space out the monitoring. Reinforcing and acknowledging when these goals are met in a positive way. So, as you see the study behaviors, providing some sort of reinforcement. This is the opposite of punishment, and it is a more effective way to enhance the behaviors you want to see, as well as negotiate that some weeks may not require as much study time. Or, like I said, mood disorders, physical illness may interfere with their study goals being met that week. Um, and that when we do need to implement some punishment, that the punishment fits the crime. So, for an example, what this could look like with the middle path is if they only did 14 hours of study time, they didn't hit their bare minimum of 15 hours a week. And it really was a behavior that you need to address, like an avoidant behavior. You may shorten their curfew by an hour. You may say, I'm going to kind of match it. Too strict would be you are unable to go out until things are done, or you're just unable to go out the entire next week because you're off an hour. So, looking at how do we match the punishment and make sure it kind of fits the crime and isn't too robust and too strict. There could be an example if someone drops down from full time school student status to part time status. And if you're financially supporting them, you may say, instead of cutting them off completely financially, you might drop down to about half of what you're providing them in terms of financial support, or have like a phase out plan to say, I'll support you this much for this long, but it kind of will start to step down. And if you go back up to full time status, this is where I'll meet you. So being too strict can really create a lot of burnout for parents. This is usually something that you cannot maintain without building a lot of resentment. And what we'll talk about in the next dilemma is a lot of dependency on you. And so you can monitor on a way in a way that's more balanced for you, that gives them flexibility and responsibility and a place to kind of step into that ownership for them. But when you're constantly monitoring their grades and their study habits and what is going on kind of moment to moment, you are going to burn out. And you will get often to a point where you say, fine, I throw my hands up. You're on your own. I'm not going to be involved anymore. And you're going to remove all the supports in place, and you might kind of find yourself swinging over to that too loose side. And that is really dysregulating to someone who's already dysregulating. It's kind of really disorienting to try to figure out how to move forward from where they are. So while they are engaging in problematic behaviors that interfere with these goals and these expectations, we still want to have that middle path approach, figuring out really what's needed and how we move forward. So just kind of mentioning too, monitoring really is an age specific thing, as well as um, life threatening aspect. So what I mean by that is to say, sometimes it is required of us to be too strict, and we need to stay on the too strict side because of life threatening behaviors. And that makes sense. So there may be certain check in frequencies that are going to really be justified depending on suicidality, self harm, disordered eating, etc. And what's really important is that this is an ebb and flow. So, what happens for a lot of families is that that strictness makes sense at one time, however, begins to not make sense at other times as their young person progresses. And so, what's important is to be able to figure out and realize when you need to start loosening, when we need to tighten and when we need to loosen. And you're going to find that this balance is more like a gymnast stance, that there's going to be this movement between too loose and too strict. So it's kind of a moving part. It's not going to be a fixed state. So you have to be able to move your pendulum with really what's needed. And that's going to rely a lot on your wise mind to be able to be responsive to the needs that are, not what has been or what could be. So, kind of keeping that in mind and kind of keeping in terms of like appropriateness to certain monitoring, how we can recognize that we can't monitor everything. And so there is going to be limits always in place to monitoring, and that we really want to help shape kids and young adults in terms of being able to self monitor as well, so that they can find this middle path themselves between being too loose and too strict. So, a lot of ways forward through these polarization points or these dilemmas is that we want to build collaboration with your young person. We want to invite them into the issue and say, how do we work on this? Here's what I'm thinking. What are your thoughts on certain punishments, certain consequences if these things aren't done? Maybe they can bring some pretty solid um, guidelines for you and for them, essentially. Let them have a voice, and at the end of the day, you can still determine what really makes sense in terms of consequences and guidelines. So, keeping in mind, walking the middle path is often about seeing the validity and the truth in both sides of the issue. Most likely, you're going to take an opposing stance. And so, we want to bring in questions like, well, what is the truth in their side? What is the experience in their side? What are the barriers to their experience? And with someone that's saying, I just can't study that much, the truth may be that it's very difficult to have energy, focus, and interest in studying. So you want to help them solve the issue. And sometimes the best place is to help by acknowledging and becoming curious about their experience of their side of it. So let's choose one issue that you argue over the most and place yourself kind of on this pendulum. Where do you find yourself in terms of the too loose versus too strict? Do you find yourself fairly balanced? Do you find yourself pretty much over on the strictness side, on the too loose side, or swinging back and forth between the two sides? So I want you to take that next space on the handout so that you can really point out what's another issue that comes up, and then where can you start to see yourself in this polarization or in this dilemma. And I want you to think about and take your time with this and pace yourself, but what keeps you here? If you find yourself on the too strict side, what are the reasons for staying over there? What are the pros and cons? What are the feelings that you have? If you feel like you are not open at all to changing this too strict side or to this too loose side, I would ask yourself, well, what's the threat here? Like what do I feel could be really dangerous in moving or changing my stance on this? And I think for a lot of parents that are in your shoes, sometimes fear of safety is the biggest one that keeps us so stuck. We are so scared that our young person isn't going to make it, or they're going to have so much more pain and so much more like obstacles if they do not do these things, whatever it might be. So, thinking about what am I fearing? What if any fear is holding me on this side of the canyon? My guess is there's some big emotion behind it and some history here. And those are very justified and very validly painful for you, as there's probably a long history or maybe a traumatic history that you've experienced with your young adult and your teenager. So I get that you don't want to go back and that you really want to ensure safety. Sometimes it could be additional reasons, like you were raised a particular way. There could be pretty strong religious beliefs or cultural standards. And sometimes we just don't know what else to do. Right? So we have to really look at, how do I navigate? How do I settle in if I can't apply my cultural norms here? If I can't apply my religious beliefs here because it keeps us polarized, is there a level to which I can? Can I work to still see my young person's truth on this? Can I be heard and recognized for this? And how do we really walk this middle path forward without compromising kind of everything that I believe to be true, or all of my belief systems? And that's often very challenging for a lot of parents in your shoes. And that's where I would say maybe engaging in some counseling sessions or some coaching sessions to help you sort some of those pieces out, to which you can maybe reevaluate not the value itself or the belief itself, but maybe in how it's applied and how it looks and how it shows up in your life and in your young person's life, especially surrounding parenting. So we're going to pause here. The next dilemma will be the fostering independence versus dependence in the next video.